to the Roar of Love podcast, where spiritual wisdom meets the wild human experience and heart-centered transformation takes center stage. Hosted on Sacred Light, each week we'll explore deep truths, the spiritual path, and the power of love to awaken and heal. So let's get started. Today, I would like to start in a place that might be obvious to some and less obvious to others. So this is about the divine masculine and the feminine. There are two energies that move in our world and act as poles. There are many energies, right, that move in our world. But when we reduce what we are looking at to a primary duality, which has polarity, we have two energies, and we sometimes call these energies masculine and feminine. I think it's important to put this in place as a premise, and what I'm saying, all of it, because it allows us to build our understanding as we start talking about how these energies show up in our day-to-day life. So we see these energies and work in the world: positive and negative, active and receptive, dynamic and stabilizing. And no matter where we go or what we study, we can see these energies at play. So Hermetics teaches us that if something is true, then it's universally true. So if it's true, it's universally true. So if these energies exist in the world, right, they exist. They don't exist in one place and not in another. They exist totally. So before we get into some of the day-to-day details of what of the masculine and feminine, healing the divide between the masculine and feminine, I think it's important to go back to the fundamentals. And the first part is the agreement that these two energies exist, that they are polarity, and that they're both important to our world. So why do I say that they're both important? Because what would happen if we removed one of these polarities or made one of them dysfunctional, right? If we're dysfunctional, we could say toxic masculinity, the shadow feminine, right? What would happen? And so just take a moment to think about that. Take a moment to think about what might happen if we make one of these energies wrong, bad, or try to remove it from our world. So one of the themes I often teach on is respect. I teach this because it's really easy for us to get caught up in our narcissistic loops, to lose sight of how important the difference, what is different from us is. So respect, from my perspective, is a return to the fundamentals, a willingness to recognize what is good and beneficial, and even in what we don't like. This doesn't mean that everything is good or beneficial in its entirety, but that everything has a purpose or function. So one of the greatest gifts that I got from my study of Umbanda was actually the understanding of this. So in the study of all the different energies and the way that they work inside of the practice in Umbanda, I got to see that every energy has a place where it really helps, where it works, where it is maximally effective. And then every energy has an area where it's not, where it's at its deficit, where its impact is less than helpful. And so through this, instead of being judgmental, I like this energy, I don't like this energy is good, this energy isn't bad, I get to see it within its context. And from that context, to be able to discern how it was helpful and beneficial and how it was less helpful, or where it was less helpful and beneficial. So in this, whenever we're confronted or whenever we're connecting with a new type of energy, we have the ability to look and say, okay, how might this energy best be used? What's the benefit of it? What supports it in the best possible way? And then what are the areas where maybe it's at its deficit, where it's not working in the optimal way? So, when we start out with an understanding that these energies are primary in our world, masculine and feminine as a polarity, and we understand that each one has an important function that is no less or more important than the other, and then we start to discuss the issues of men and women, we have something to turn to. We have a little bit more clarity because we're starting from a premise where both have their rightness, and both are worthy of respect, and both have places where they have strengths and weaknesses. So ways that they can show up, ways that can be used, context which they'll be stronger or less strong. So my own journey with these energies, right? So my own journey with my masculine and feminine inside of me, and also on the outside of me, it was complicated. I was taught to negate the feminine in myself, by and large. So I was taught that the feminine, the expression of it, really wasn't going to get me what I wanted. It's like I grew up in a time where it was about like kind of being a woman and being a successful woman or a success as a woman was equated to being out in the world, being successful in the workplace, and to do that it was necessary to bring in certain like more masculine aspects of myself in order to be able to move in the world that was in move in the world that was more effective. And that I started to downplay, for various different reasons, I started to downplay some of the feminine aspects of me in order to be able to move in the world in a way that I thought was going to be most effective. And I had very few role models. At that time, there were very few role models for what it meant to be feminine in a powerful way or powerful in a feminine way. I had an understanding of what it meant to be powerful as a woman, but in a more masculine way. And so this is something that really evolved over time. I came to understand it over time. The things that were in play, the concepts and beliefs that were in play in the relationship of the expression, in relationship to the expression of the feminine in my life. And so to add to this, I sort of had one dimensional or flat archetypes to work with. I didn't really have a lot of visible archetypes of the complexity of the feminine that I came to have later in my life. So that gave me a very limited understanding without the lack of role models, with a sense that I should move forward in the world in a masculine way. And with kind of these one-dimensional archetypes, I wasn't really able to understand a lot of what the feminine was about. And so I was kind of acting out this way that I was acting out in this way, or I was acting in this way in this world that wasn't very rooted in the truth of my feminine understanding. So I was acting often in a way that was representative or represented or acted out more of a masculine way of being. And in some ways, a more toxic masculine way of being because of a lack of understanding. So these are kind of the challenges. I bring these challenges up because they're indicative of a period of time that we went through, a period of time that we went through in the relationship of the masculine and the feminine that's still very much active in our world today. These dynamics run through and more run through the relationship between the masculine and the feminine in our world. And so these challenges actually they create a study, they create a ground to be able to learn more. So they're not necessarily a bad thing in and of ourselves, but as we start to become more conscious of what's operating, what perspectives we have on masculine and feminine, how they're operating in the background, and how they're coloring the view that we have of how masculine and feminine moves in our world, it's helpful. So I encourage you to take some time to consider what your views are. What are the main movements, the social elements, the cultural elements, the things that have influenced your view of the masculine and feminine leading up to this point. So if we believe that these energies are foundational in our world, right? If we believe that energy, and so we've been talking about energy overall, the energy of the masculine and the feminine, right? But let's go a little bit further back. So what is it like? So we're saying, oh, these things, there's this energy that exists in our world. So if we believe that energy is foundational to our world, right? So which science shows us, and we've been shown by other means, then there must be a correlation between these energies that we've been talking about, the masculine and the feminine, and or any energy really that we were talking about in the forms of our world. Simply put, that's why there is a difference between men and women. So there are foundational energies of masculine and feminine that move in the world. And yes, they move inside of both men and women. But it is the correlation between these energies and their expression in form that creates our understanding. It creates the differentiation. So, for example, we might know that even the most masculine woman is not the same as a man, and even the most feminine man is not the same as a woman. And to break this down further, it's just like that. There is. So to break this down a little bit further, it doesn't mean that we do not have an ability to choose how much energy we would like to express, right? We do have this choice, but it doesn't turn one thing into another. So we can always change how the energy is expressed, but one thing doesn't get changed into another. If it did, then we wouldn't actually be able to work with energy. Why is this? Because if we weren't able to see a correlation between the energy that's the foundation of the world and that's coming through and its expression in the world, we would know there would be no way to work with it. We wouldn't be able to do things like to do science or magic or any of those things that allow us to understand how to work with energy and it through its expression in the world. So this, like, recognizing this correlation is important for anyone who considers themselves spiritual, because without it, all we would have is imagination. So the correlation between energy and the physical is important because without that correlation, all we would have is imagination. Would have no connection between the energetic source and the form that it takes. So these energies exist, they're foundational, and we can see when they're manifesting. And they have certain results when they do. And we can see that sometimes in the form of men and women. And we can see that sometimes in various different forms that come into the world. So again, that's not to say that a woman only has feminine energy. We also know that not to be true, right? But that there's a correlation between what it is that is moving through. So if we're going to ground this in a little bit, then how do we get these energies to work together in a way that's healthy and supportive and most in service of what we want to create in the world? So this is in terms of relationship, right? So basically, we've observed that there are two energies, that these energies exist in a polarity, that the polarity that we can call masculine and feminine, we can call it a number of other things. And that this has some correlation to form, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be able to work with it. So first, we've got that. Now that we're working with it in form, how is it that we can work with it most effectively? And we have so many questions in this area, so many questions, but we actually can't answer the questions very well if we don't understand some of these fundamentals. Why? Because we start to get into very confusing terrain. But when we have the ability to regroup to these fundamentals, when we can go back and understand a little bit about energy, we can understand a little bit about the way that things are moving. We're not having the conversation so much about ideas or ideology. We're actually having the conversation on a different level. This is very important. So it allows us a regroup point. So that as we're coming to solutions, as we're trying to understand some of the things that are happening between the masculine and feminine, we have a way to be able to regroup. So one of the things that I've done is that I've asked for some questions about the masculine and feminine that I'm going to talk about today. And that's also something that you're able to place into the chat so that I can answer more of them live time as well, what you've got coming up in this moment. So we're looking at what are some of these, like how, now that we've got this premise, right? What are some of the ways that we might talk about or start to work on some of the problems that are here? Right. And then you'll start to notice that as we take this spiritual understanding and we start to bring it into our conversation, it helps to illuminate, it helps to create greater and greater clarity. It's one of the reasons that we go down this particular road. So we don't necessarily need to have all the answers in the moment. We need to have a pathway to being able to create those. So the first question that I got asked here is, what do you think caused some of the challenges between men and women? Like what has caused some of the challenges that are being faced between men and women right now? And so some of what I talked about before in my own story is that some of what happened in terms of the way that women were brought into their independence and their empowerment actually has created a bit of some challenges. So let's take a look at that a little bit, because I am for sure not saying that I think that women should not be empowered or independent. So women, but how they grew inside of that included some negation. It included I can say this for myself, right? It included a movement away from a negation of men. So in order for me to be an independent woman, it means that I, need to have a certain relationship or lack thereof with men. That my empowerment means that certain dynamics in my relationship with men are taken apart, because that was kind of the thinking that went with it. So that this idea that women to become most empowered needed to be independent, separate from, and in a relationship with men, or in a relationship with men that had certain types of restrictions, the way that that went into place actually started to challenge the relationship itself. Again, I'm not saying that everything inside of this was negative. It's just that along with it, there was an erosion of certain fundamental and important dynamics. We lost sight. Maybe that's a better way to say it. We lost sight of some of the foundational relationships and dynamics, things that we could have had both our empowerment, and we can, our empowerment and our independence, if that is even something that, like, I mean, it's aspired to as a concept, but we would really have to dive into what that actually meant. And so we can have this empowerment, we can have all of the things that we have been going for, or many of them at very least. And we can also still preserve this foundational right relationship energetically, going back to what it was I was saying before. So we're looking at, what does it mean to create a foundational relationship between the masculine and the feminine energies within ourselves and outside of ourselves in our lives? And how can we do that? How can empowerment exist with that, coexist with that? And it absolutely can. We can explore ways that that can happen. But one of the things that needs to happen in order to support that in coming into being is that we can't really negate each of the energies. We can't negate the masculine or make it bad. We can't negate the feminine and make it bad, because neither way actually results in the type of empowerment that we're trying to bring into our lives. So because right, we're damaging that fundamental polarity, that fundamental duality that exists inside of ourselves and outside of ourselves. So if we negate, if we demonize, if we make bad, if we marginalize, if we make harmful one of these base energies, then we're going to lose that foundational right relationship. And then we can't really have empowerment for either group. We might have power. We might have power over. We might have power dynamics, but we won't have a true sense of empowerment. That true sense of empowerment actually comes from right relationship. That is actually through the building and understanding of right relationship that we are then able to stand in the totality of our being and come into a better relationship with others. So the challenge with this is that we've lost the understanding of the primary function of each of these relationships. So each of these energies, So we've lost the primary understanding of each of these energies. And so it's very difficult for us to really be honoring, to be respectful, to come into a deeper appreciation for what is there, for how each of those energies informs our lives and informs our relationships. So we need to understand the primary function of these relationships. We need to understand them at their core, the way that they operate. That's a spiritual study. It's a spiritual study to understand how an energy moves in the world in this way that we're talking about. And so the more that we're able to understand these energies without bias and just their functioning, the more that we're able then to build their right relationship their way of coming into right relationship with each other. And the result of that is empowering. That's a really important thing to say, because what we could say is the result of not understanding and lack of respect and the inability to understand the relationships between things. It results in the degradation, the falling apart, and the disempowering of what's there. And the understanding of those things, the primary function, how they move, their health and well-being, how they relate together in the best possible way, leads to empowerment and strengthening of both. And one could say, well, okay, yes, that seems like a very obvious point, but it actually isn't when you start to get into dialogue about the challenges between men and women. We forget that foundationally, right relationship, under this understanding and respect, coming into a relationship foundationally creates more empowerment. So as we create more understanding, as we create more respect, as we are able to build in a better way, the result of that is empowerment. The result of the opposite is disempowerment. And so when we know this to be true, we can sink into the deeper understanding of the foundational energies, these foundational energies, how they live and move in our life. And then we can start to treat them with respect, full respect. We can learn how to do that. We can relearn how to do that, because I would say that many of us have lost sight on how we can actually do that in our lives. So we get to relearn how to do that. As we relearn how to do that, we can start to rebuild relationships specifically, between men and women, or we can rebuild relationships between the masculine and the feminine. So that is understanding how to shift that foundational piece is something that makes a really big difference in the challenges that are being faced right now. And when we look at something like what I was explaining in my own personal story, we can start to say, oh, right, here's where we kept stepping away from that understanding. It seemed like it was a good road, but if I'm not listening to what else is out there, if I'm not willing to understand what is not me, right? Like I was saying earlier, if I'm not willing to understand what's not me, the result of what I'm doing is probably not going to be effective. It's kind of like, it's similar. It's like kind of stepping over the other person's, hurt body or something like that. You're just saying, okay, well, I'm going where I'm going, but it doesn't really matter what the result is. And it actually does matter what the result is. And I think that most women would agree with that. They would say, hey, wait a second here. If I look at my history, or I look at the history of women as I understand it, I can see a lot of examples where the understanding and the value of women wasn't taken into consideration. And so in that, I understand personally how this process works, how the negation and lack of respect can lead to distancing. And we can discuss forever who's at fault for that, but that isn't really going to get us anywhere. What's going to get us somewhere is actually understanding these primary energetic functions, and then being willing to do something about it, being willing to engage in the healing process and move forward in our lives, and collectively and individually. So at this point in time, one of the main recommendations is that we stop looking for the culprit, especially between the relationships of the masculine and the feminine. and between men and women. We stop looking for the culprit and we start looking towards really understanding what those energies are and how to bring them into right relationship. Like, why not? Right? Why not go in that direction? It seems like the result would be empowerment and the strengthening of both of those energies. So we have a lot that we can explore in that particular area. So my next question here is about the incompetency in women. So why does incompetency tend to come up as a pain point for women in regard of how they use and interact with these energies? So I'm not sure I totally understand this question, but the way that I'm reading it is about women being portrayed, or their way of being labeled in a way that is pejorative, and that this becomes a struggle for women because the way that they are being is being labeled in a way that's problematic. So if I'm reading this correctly, there is, I think it's largely because, and it's going back to this understanding, right? There's a limited understanding of the feminine. So specifically in its complex and undefinable nature. So there is a desire to simplify this. And it's not easily simplified. Like the divine feminine, in my view, is very and beautifully complex and undefinable and changeable. And in that, it doesn't conform well to certain types of understanding. And this lack of conformity to certain types of understanding leads to areas of, you could say, conflict or oversight. So in other words, a label or a form is being put on the feminine, where the feminine can actually fill it in a particular moment because that's the feminine. And so it can actually work with that quite fine. But that is, if to then say, okay, that's what the feminine is, it doesn't last. It gets eroded quickly. It reaches its limit because it's always more. It's changeable. So that lack of understanding leads to many challenges with the restriction of our world. And it's a fundamental duality inside of the feminine itself. So it gets very complex. And so this leads to like in manifestation in everyday life. In my view, it can lead to a sense of women just not quite feeling right as they meet the world. And that because they feel kind of labeled or put into something that is much more one-dimensional than they actually are. And I would say all people experience this to some degree. It's part of the nature of working with form. But with women, I think that this winds up being particularly painful because the way that they have a difficult time really holding their own complexity and embracing their own complexity. And they're the ones that need to learn how to do this, and women helping women being able to do this. And then advocating for this complex understanding of how the feminine manifests in the world. is something that could be very helpful. And until we have that, we sort of have like a bit of disconnect from the entirety of who we are as women, and or as the feminine moves in this world. And so this is a loss of understanding, that like a type of loss of understanding, like I was talking about we haven't quite learned how to capture the complexity of the female energy, because it doesn't like to be captured, because it doesn't allow itself to be kind of labeled, made simple very easily. And so we can live with it or be in relationship to it in a way where it's both known and unknown. So it's both known and unknown. When the mind gets a hold of that, it can create a type of insecurity, you could almost say. And that maybe is the word incompetency that was used in the question. So we need to reclaim and explore this. There's actually a need for women to understand themselves better, to understand what they're about, to understand that's again a study, a spiritual study of how energy moves. So there's a need to explore this feminine energy, right? And of course, keeping in mind that this feminine energy moves in various different ways, but women moving this in and through their lives in whatever capacity they're moving it through benefit from an exploration and understanding of what it is. So there are benefits and problems of women's spaces, because women's spaces can potentially help with this type of understanding. But one of the things that can happen is that they actually just become a confirmation of bias and a confirmation of limitation. So they do what the opposite of what would be beneficial for them to be able to do in this regard. And so many of the problems, going back to the challenges between many men and women, many of the challenges can actually happen inside of these spaces that are designed actually to help with the problem, help women and men understand the masculine and the feminine, which we need more space to explore so that we can work with it more skillfully and build more healing relationships. But what happens is usually we don't discuss it at a deep enough level. And we put in it instead, it winds up becoming a labeling or a replication of the problems. And then that leads to kind of a stuck space. And many people have experienced that. I've talked to them about it when they're in women's groups or men's groups, that's one of the things that happens, is that there are these patterns that we get stuck in rather than being able to go into the deeper components. And one of the solutions to this is actually archetypal study. So by starting to understand how energies move, in this case, to answer this particular question, the archetype of the feminine, when we start to understand more about the different archetypes of the feminine, then we start to get a much broader, more complex, more complete view of what it is that is possible, what it is that we're working with. And then all sorts of choices come up, because we are creators in our world, right? So in being creators in a world, we can open up opportunities. So if we start to understand these aspects of the feminine more, then we can start to find new and creative ways of bringing that into the world. As we find new and creative ways of bringing that into the world, it has more full expression. As it has more full expression, everyone gains an understanding, and we're able to then find new solutions and new places of harmony and reconnection and relationship between, in this case, we're talking about the masculine and the feminine. So this is our direction. One of the directions that we can go in is to, again, start to study the energies of the masculine and feminine as a primary duality, right? So that then we can start to understand how they work optimally. And then in both of them, both in men and women, this time it was a question about women, but in both men and women, we can look at the archetypes and we can start to understand those archetypes so that we can build out a much more complete view of how these energies move, and we can work with them in a way that's respectful. So that's one of the things that happens as we start to engage in spiritual study, as we start to look at how energies move, no matter what the tradition is, as we start to look at how these energies move, the study itself allows us to work in ways that are in the world, in normal, everyday human life, meaning our everyday relationships, everything that we do. It allows us to work in all of those ways in a way that is more deeply in tune with the fundamental truths of things. Remember, I was talking about that correlation, the correlation between the energy and what it is that we have in the world. So the more that we make that understanding and start to work with the correlations, the deeper, the more effect we're going to get, the more value we're going to be able to see, the more options that are going to be created by that process. So this is how the understanding of spiritual energies, and this time, right, we're talking about the masculine and feminine, but in the understanding of spiritual energies really helps us change our everyday life. This is not an abstract study or an interesting study that's disconnected. It's actually something that allows us to create more options, opportunities, health and well-being in every aspect of our life. So the next question is, and I think this will probably be the last question for the day, is about how, as a man, right, how can I create or allow a woman to feel safe to be expressed in her feminine? And so great question, right? And I would add to this, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit, in that let's look at how to make both the masculine and the feminine feel ideally expressed in what they are, right? And the first piece, right, is understanding. We're looking at understanding and a deeper understanding of the foundational energies are at work and how they work together. So we're moving beyond just looking at things from a psychological lens. We're moving on beyond looking at things from a cultural influence and things like that. All of those things are interesting. They are helpful. They are beneficial, but we're moving beyond them to get at these foundational energies. And like I've been talking about this entire time. So why does this help to create safety or empowerment? Or why does it allow for a more full expression of a particular energy? It's right because of all of those things that I've been talking about up to now. So we get there in part through listening and respect. So another thing that we can do, right, is we learn to listen and we learn to be respectful of. So what that comes down to is a desire to truly understand what is different than us. Which, if like there's some areas of overlap where it's like, oh, I can understand that. I can extrapolate and understand what that person, right, is all about, or what that energy is all about. And fortunately, we all have masculine and feminine energy inside of us. So we're all able to understand and find crossover. However, when it comes to things that are different than us, that we feel less identified, we might feel less identified with, we have less understanding. It's difficult for most people to get outside of themselves and truly be able to take in the experience of another person. And we're actually all to some degree limited in our ability to do this, because we are bound by our own way of being. However, working in that direction is incredibly helpful. So listening and being respectful, truly trying to understand what it is that is going on with someone that is different than us. In this case, we're talking about the feminine. Then, or we could be talking about the masculine, right? In this way, in listening to listening to and being respectful and really trying to learn from what's different than us, that allows us to really get into what that person or what that energy is all about. And naturally, as a result of that, can be our desire to create an ideal environment for that particular way of being. So this is something that I've taught at various different times through the practice of energetic study and devotion, which is that when we're working with an energy, we can create an ideal energy or an ideal environment for that energy to thrive. Why? We do it devotion. We do it out of love. We do it out of respect. We do it because we want to see more of it in the world. And so we can treat each other that way. We can say, oh, okay, with love, with respect, with devotion, and because I have these things for you, I would like you to see your full expression come forward in the world. And the only way that that can happen, or one important component of that happening, is to actually find, is to create more understanding, to have this listening, this respect, this understanding of the other happen, so that then I create a more ideal environment for that energy to thrive, simply because I love it, simply because I want to see more of it in the world. Right? So now do you understand why, going back, it's so important that we get the foundational nature of these energies, that we understand that each one has an important place, that we begin to see that there's a correlation between these energies and the way that they're represented in the world, even if we don't like the way that they're represented in the world, and that we choose to understand more and more why that energy is moving that way. And then we become supportive of how and help to build in an ideal environment for that energy to be able to move in the world, which then allows it to evolve, to become higher and higher. So an ideal environment is one that truly cares for something, right? Not that placates it or brings out, it like satisfies like instant gratification or things like that, right? We're not talking about that in Rome. We're talking about what helps to truly support that energy and moving forward, which brings out the best of what's there, which then pours back into the relationship in terms of there being a greater and greater harmony, more and more healing that is brought in and between these energies. So in the case of a man and a woman, and the man wanting to do something to allow the woman to be able to feel all of herself, to be more expressed, these are some of the things that are helpful. They're helpful to be able to move into a place of truly understanding and appreciating. Now, what that means, what that looks like, what listening looks like, what respect looks like, what holding looks like, all of that kind of thing actually requires a deeper exploration of the relationship between the masculine and feminine. Because if we don't do that, then what happens is we label behavior as either doing that or not doing that, instead of actually understanding at the root energy. So in other words, then we turn around, the woman turns around to the man and she says, "You're not listening to me. You're not being respectful of who I am because you're not doing it the way that I want you to." Right? So, right, this is actually the lack of understanding coming back towards the man, because we actually need to understand that foundational way of expression in order to really see what listening, respect, and cultivating an environment is like. So we're not able to get at it just through saying, "Here's what you need to do," to each other, right? "You need to act more like me," right? We actually need to understand those foundational energies and how they work, and then start to understand some of these ways to build in more harmonious, energetic environments, more supportive to each one of these energies. And that is a back and forth thing. That is an understanding that keeps developing itself. And what we most typically do, like I was saying, is that we label and we say, "Hey, no, this is what it should look like. This is what you should be doing. You should be acting like me. You're not doing the things that I need to be safe, or you're not doing the things that I need to feel respected," or whatever it is. And that is not, does not make it work. So, okay, so back from the top, we're going to wrap up here. And in wrapping up, we are going to just take a look at these main points. So it's understanding these energies at their root, and then understanding that they're foundational, understanding that there's a correlation between them and manifestations in the world. We can get into exactly what those correlations are. We didn't get into it so much at this particular point in time, but there is a correlation that we're working with, that we can observe and that we can work with consistently. Then from that premise, we start to work with some of these components of understanding more and more how the energies move in that primary duality, understanding some of the archetypes of each one, and then understanding how it manifests in the individual that's sitting across from us. learning to build in ways that support these foundational energetics and being creative in that. We don't have solutions necessarily. That's so important to know, because it's not that there aren't good ideas. There are lots of good ideas and there are lots of good tools out there that we can use, but we're actually healing a divide. We're healing a break. So in that, we need to take these tools and use them to the best of our ability to start to find new ways of working and interacting. And each one of us has the power to create that. Each one of us has the power to build in our own life, within ourselves, within our relationships with others, new and different ways to build healthy relationships between these masculine and feminine. And of course, it's appreciation and respect that helps us create more space for these. It's like a true, deeper understanding, a willingness to really appreciate, respect, and love and understand how they show up in in our world, and what each one's function is, so that we can really honor its expression and its value in everything that we do. All right. I want to thank you for listening to the Roar of Love podcast. If today's episode spoke to you, visit Sacred Lights at sacredlights.com, and you can get more insights, community, and guidance for your journey, as well as be informed about all episodes of this Roar of Love podcast. Until next time, stay open, stay true, and keep answering love's call.